You want to know the way of it, what it was that led to the hangings and the whippings, the massacre and the killings that went on after that? Folks getting even, nigh 40 years on. I reckon most would tell you they knew who was in the right and who was in the wrong. And I reckon was you'd ask five different people, you'd hear five different stories. As for me, I ain't so sure. I've waited most of my life for God Almighty to speak unto me and explain it all. Maybe lean down from a dark thundercloud and roar out a mighty pronouncement, or speak in tongues of fire from a bright red maple in the fall. I have listened and prayed and listened some more, and here it is a new century, but he ain't spoke to me, not once. Just now, I remember thinking, just now when they came upon us in 1863, and I felt the rough bite of the rope around my neck and hearkened to the cruel sound of the whip, the whipping of the women, the weeping of the women, and the whimper of Mary Shelton's babe, just now I thought would be a good time for him to commence to speak. All I know is that war cast a long shadow, both in the coming and the going of it, and we ain't out of that shadow yet, not by a long shot. The hunger and the hangings of that terrible day, red blood on the white snow, and the black wings of them crows, it don't hardly bear thinking of, but it's every bit of it in my memory yet, and I ain't the only one what remembers. Thanks to all of you for coming to this. Thanks to Malaprop and to Stephanie and Tricia for hosting. Thanks to all of you for joining us. It's so much fun to see some faces online or some names online that I recognize from Facebook or my blog. Or all people from my classes. I appreciate y'all coming. I'm going to talk a little bit about the writing of the book and probably read a little bit more, and then I'd love to answer any questions y'all have about the book. Tony Early, who is an author I have admired for a long time, who has become a friend, he read an early copy of Prose, and he told me in an email later that I had written a vivid and powerful book, one that I was meant to write. The thing is, for a long time, I didn't want to write this book. I managed to spend most of my life blissfully detached from the Civil War. I'm a Southerner with roots in Alabama and Pioneer, Florida, but the Civil War was never something my family talked about. I had no ideas if I had ancestors who fought on either side. Growing up in Tampa, Florida, away from battlefields and memories of that war, it was easy to dismiss it. And for whatever reason, from high school on, I was always drawn to English history and English literature. But when we moved to Madison County back in '75, Civil War history was right under my nose. I kind of ignored it and went on to spin my mystery tales about Elizabeth Goodweather. In my mind, Civil War novels were something always about battles and soldiers and stuff, and that's just wasn't for me. I like to write about people. It wasn't until the election of 2012, as our country became more and more divided, that the reality of the immediacy of war on your doorstep, of fighting against your neighbors and neighbors killing neighbors, suddenly that began to seem really kind of horribly real. And I began to plan this book, not about battles, but about people, about good, well-meaning people caught up on both sides of a deadly conflict. And today, unfortunately, it still seems relevant. Writing about the Shelton Laurel Massacre took a lot of research. I knew about the massacre. I'd seen the marker. I weekly drove past the house in Marshall where the commanding officer, Colonel Allen, the commanding officer of the troops responsible for the massacre, lived, the same house that was ransacked by men from Shelton Laurel. I knew the basic facts. During the Civil War, 13 men and boys suspected of supporting the Union were captured by Confederate forces and then later shot by a firing squad. Some called it a justified wartime action. Around here, it's remembered as a massacre. And the ensuing enmity between the people on both sides divided local inhabitants, gave my county a name it still carries, Bloody Madison. As I went on to research, I found out there was a lot more to the story than the bare facts that I had been aware of for some time. In 1861, voters in the Marshall County seat, which was the home to the few people in Madison County that owned slaves, they backed secession. The non-slave holding farmers from Shelton Laurel, which is a good ways off from Marshall, but still in the county, were opposed, and they rode into Marshall to vote against it, but they were prevented from voting. Some of these Shelton Laurel men entered the Union Army. More of them stayed home and hid out and became what was called bushwhackers, men who were resisting being conscripted by the Confederate Army and resisted violently with gunfire from behind bushes. Then, as the war went on, salt became declared a vital commodity, and it was rationed out or taken over by the Confederate government. And the people of Shelton Laurel were not allowed to come into Marshall and buy salt. They could come into Marshall, but they could not buy salt. And in those times, you had to have salt to preserve the meat, the hog meat, the beef that would get your family through the winter. So in early January of 1863, in the evening, a force of 50-some men from Shelton Laurel rode into Marshall, raided the town's salt repository, and went on, after evidently drinking a good bit, to ransack quite a few houses and stores, including Colonel Allen's house. They ran up the stairs, and the story is they even snatched the bedding from the bedclothes from the children who were lying there sick with scarlet fever. Soon after this, a troop of Confederate soldiers from Allen's command went out to Shelton Laurel in search of the people who had done this raid on Marshall. They couldn't find any men. The men who were there were in hiding. Plus, many of the men who had been part of the raid were Union soldiers on leave, and they had gone back across the lines to the Union Army. The Confederate forces went through Laurel looking for men and began to torture the women to make them tell where the men were hiding. They strung them up as if they were going to hang them, not quite hanging them, but almost. They whipped them. They took one woman's baby and laid it in the snow, wouldn't let her get to it. It was a terrible time. Eventually, they rounded up 13 more or less random men and boys and put them overnight in a cabin belonging to Judy Shelton. The next day, those men were marched. They were told they were going to be taken to Tennessee for trial. But the next day, they were marched a little ways away, shot, and their bodies thrown into a ditch. That was the Shelton Laurel Massacre. The historical accounts, which may or may not be totally factual, quote actual pleas from the men, the victims, and I used some of these in my novel. One man called out, "Shelt Ray, Saul Carter, can you shoot your old comrades in cold blood?" The youngest boy, 13 years old, who was shot, said, "Please, boys, don't shoot me in the face." And later on went to beg that they would let him go. You know, they'd shot him in both arms, and they said, "You've shot me in both arms. You've killed my father and brother. Please let me go home to my mother and sisters. I can get well." I was delighted to come across this and use this in my story. From the beginning of planning the book, I wanted to use multiple voices, people from both sides of the story. After a lot of trial and error, I had a list of possibly, 12 or 15 people that I thought I might use. I decided on two historical figures from the Confederate side. First of all, current Colonel Lawrence Allen's wife, Polly. Polly allowed me to show the woman's view of what was going on the Confederate side. And of course, she could tell what her husband was thinking about. and her husband's reactions to all of this. I used the device. She was in the story. She is writing to a friend who is a girlhood friend who married and moved to the north, and she writes to this friend over and over, and it becomes sort of a journal. She never sends the letter, but she writes to her friend Emmy, and through her letters to Emmy, we discover a lot of her thoughts because she won't share what she really thinks with her husband. My dear Emmy, I take up my pen once more to add to my never-sent letter, begun when the world was still a sweet and rational place. Never sent and never shall be, for it is only in this letter that I can unburden myself. Before Lawrence and the children, indeed, before all my acquaintances, I must maintain a facade of strong determination. It is the role the Colonel's lady must play, even to the bitter end. But to you, nay, to the papery semblance of you, I will speak truth. Our glorious Second American Revolution is going badly. The two sanguine hopes for a rapid conclusion of hostilities have been dashed, and the naive dream of two great nations existing amicably side by side seems like to prove a nightmare. Lawrence does not speak of it, either during his brief visits home nor in his letters, but I hear from all sides that East Tennessee is showing itself a rebel to the rebellion, and in our own county, adjacent to East Tennessee, the whole of remote, unruly Shelton Laurel is reckoned a hotbed of Unionists. So Polly is one of my voices. My second Confederate voice is Colonel Key. He was second in command to Polly's husband, and he is the one who commanded the firing squad that killed the men in Laurel. He was a respected position in Marshall before the war, and to the end would defend his actions as being justifiable by the military code. He is more or less the villain of the piece, but as I say, he felt that his actions were justified. Here's a little bit of what Keith has to say. By God, Lawrence, it makes me furious. Long ago, we should have come down on those accursed Laurelites like the wolf on the fold. And now this outrage. They ride into Marshall, bold as brass, raid the government salt stores. Lawrence says nothing, but nods distractedly as he drives his pen over the paper before him. His face is weary, and his eyes are those of a much older man. The ambiguity of his situation, suspension with the charges of muster roll irregularities, is still unresolved. It has taken its toll, rendering him hesitant and tentative in all things. I step closer to the fire and try to curb my impatience. Heretofore, Lawrence has been slow to act against the Laurelites, but now he claims that his period of suspension is over, and he is petitioning General Heft to allow us to lead our forces once more into that accursed valley. The necessity of an act of retribution against those blackguards who plundered the salt depot and carried out who knows what other heinous acts is self-evident. I am eager to be on the move, but Lawrence is cautious and will not act without Heft's orders. Oh, that I held the command. There's a time for hesitation, but surely there's also a time for bold initiative, and I am the man for that time. Those were our two Confederates. From the people of Shelton Laurel, I chose, first of all, Marthy White, who is described in the records as an idiot girl. She was one of the women tortured, but I could find almost nothing else about her, except that she married and later on was living with her parents. The census is about all that I could use to find out about her. So I felt free to improvise a bit with Marthy. I'm trying to write a novel, not history, and I made her a mute rather than an idiot. Who knows what idiot girl meant to these people at this time. I made her a mute and gave her some surprising powers, I think. This is a little bit of Marthy. Of course, she doesn't speak out loud to anyone, but she has plenty of thoughts. The sun is slicing through the strand of poplars above the path, and there is bars of dark and light beneath our feet. I step slow and careful from light to dark and dark to light, taking care not to put my foot in both at once. Light to dark to light, back again. The pattern sings in my head, full of some kind of message, but what it is I cannot tell. I am filled with the same kind of feeling that comes just before I get a seeing, and I slow and stop, waiting for what might come. Mommy and Pap and the rest of them, Kate and Billy, Lavina, Josie and Paul, is up ahead, hot-footing along so as to have extra time for visiting before the preaching begins. Just as they reach a bend in the trail, Mommy looks back to see am I coming. She makes an angry face at me and shifts baby Sam to her other hip. I declare, Martha, she puffs, hurrying back to grab my arm and give it a jerk that like to pull it loose. When you don't get your way, you're as bad to bow up as any old mule. Now leave off that shuffling and step along smart like, or I'll cut me a switch. I ain't much of a one for church going and such. Generally, I find a reason to lay out whenever I can. There's always too many folks turning to look at me and whisper behind their hands. And once, during a revival, they all of them mobbed about me and prayed that my tongue would be loosed and I would be able to speak like any other young'un. I have heard Mommy tell how I started off babbling and saying words like any other young'un, but by the time I was 3, I had quit talking altogether. Mommy reckons it might have been on account of the bad fever I took that summer. She says the angel of death was hovering, and they had almost give up hope, but then the fever broke. And that's Marthy. As my research continued, and Kimmy Shelton lent me a copy of the Shelton genealogy, I started coming across the name of Judy Shelton, still fondly remembered in Shelton Laurel as Aunt Judy or Granny Judy. She was nowhere in my original plan for the novel, but as I pieced together the records of the stories, and when I visited the site of her cabin, where the captured men had spent the night, and all that remains is a chimney, I touched my hand to that chimney, and it seemed like Judy just came alive in my mind. And in many ways, she became the linchpin of the story. She is a single mother of many children, a strong-minded mountain woman determined not to marry and so lose control of her inheritance. And she is the woman who, with the help of a few others, buried the bodies of the 13 massacre victims. The prologue I opened with is Judy speaking toward the end of a long life. She lived a long time. As I wrote, she began to take on a very iconic status, sort of like the voice of Shelton Laurel. And my 5th character is a totally fictional character, Sim. He is an unwilling conscript to the Confederate Army, and there were so many like him. The Army could go along and just take up men and say, okay, you have to be in the Army now, and if you desert, you'll be shot. If you were a slaveholder, you could, if you had a certain number of slaves, you could beg off because you had to stay home and keep the slaves from revolting. If you were a rich man, you could buy your way out of the service. But for poor people like Sim, there was no choice. You were taken up and you served or you deserted and you took the chance of getting shot. I'll read you a little bit of Sim. And the Lord had respect unto Abel and his offering, but unto Cain and to his offering he had not respect. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. I am puzzling out the words in my daddy's old Bible when a stranger sits down next to me. All the others here at the inn is busy drinking or gambling, and Latham, my particular friend, has gone off summers, most likely with that gap-toothed girl what was making eyes at him as she brought out the victuals. I nod to the stranger and scooch over to make room on the bench by the fireplace. You're right obliging, sir. The stranger holds out his hands to the red warmth of the glowing logs and remarks on the coolness of the evening. He is a dark-complected fellow, something like an Injun, and with a strong nose like an Injun. But his hair is kind of curly, and he has a big beard, which Injuns never do, and he don't talk like no Injun that I ever heard. Name's Aaron, he says, looking me up and down. Jake Aaron, pack peddler, working my way back to Greenville, South Carolina. So had I might have since, I'd head south to Mexico or north to Canada. He takes a deep draught of his cider and stares into the fire. I close the Bible, keeping the place with my thumb. I hear Mexico's right hot and full of bandits, I say, and I reckon Canada's right cold and full of savages. Up yonder, you'd be carrying your pack through snow and ice 9 months of the year if my geography book had the right of it. What's wrong with this country? He screws his head around and looks at me like I ain't got no sense. Son, he says, ain't you heard about Fort Sumter? Oh, this is a fine country, none better, but it's about to be torn asunder, and we are sitting right at one of the ripping places. War's coming, make no mistake. Only last night, when our wagon train put up at Garrett's Inn near Warm Springs, we had heard something of Sumter and the cry of war. A fellow there had him a Tennessee newspaper, and he was plumb full of talk about South Carolina taking the fort from the Union soldiers. There is always folks eager to tell the latest news whenever we stop at an inn, so I already knew that sometime back of this, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, maybe Texas, along with several others, had voted to leave the Union. Well, I even knew they had elected a fellow named Jeff Douglas to be the head of them, but I hadn't paid it much mind, figuring it wouldn't change my life none. My life is set and arranged according to the seasons. In the spring and summer of the year, I go with the wagon train on the Buncombe Turnpike, carrying goods between Greenville and Tennessee and Greenville and South Carolina. Come fall, I follow the droves of hogs along the same road when the packed dirt turns to a stinking slough of mud and hardship. Hard, dirty work, but a few more years and I'll have enough saved to buy me a place named Maryville in Tennessee where my girl Cora's people are. And then I'll turn farmer and my life will run according to the seasons. Mr. Aaron, I says, making light of the peddler's gloomy words, I ain't got no slaves, nor do I want none. I just want to tend a little piece of ground and raise up a family. What they do in South Carolina ain't none of my business. He don't say nothing for a spell, just shakes his head and looks at me kind of pitiful like. Then he reaches out a hand and taps the Bible, what I have lying on my knee, and he says solemn like, and Cain talked with his brother, Abel, and it came to pass when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and slew him. It gives me something of a chill hearing this stranger say the very words I was just reading. And having a character like Sim, a fictional character, gave me a chance to pull together these various voices and turn history into a novel, a story, trying to depict the moments that divide us from each other, as well as the moments that heal our wounds. All the way along of writing this, I had help. Trish Wallen from Shelton and her dad, Tony Shelton, took me on a ride and helped me get up the wooded ridge where the 13 are buried. David Shelton told me about his family's memories or the handed down memories of the massacre and gave me some interesting tidbits that I could use in the story. Kimmy Shelton, I mentioned, lent me a great genealogy that gave me a lot of ideas. And on the other side, I talked to Dr. James Allen, who gave me his family's side of the story, basically that the soldiers were justified in everything they did. And then I even heard via email from a descendant of Colonel Keith who told me about his later life, of which I had no idea, and asked me to treat him fairly. It is so daunting to write about real people with real ancestors, with real kin living in your county, and write about these people and put words in their mouth and thoughts in their heads and just hope that you treated them right. I hope I have. I would love to answer any questions. First, speaking of doing right by people, I am urging you to support Malaprop, who hosted this event. Check on their website, or if you live in the area, go by the store. I was in there yesterday. They have it very well set up. Only 9 people browsing at a time, everybody in mask. And of course, all our small businesses are struggling right now. And so I'm asking you, please, if you can, try to support them. They are such a icon in our community. And when I was in there yesterday, just being in a bookstore felt so good, so good. But now I would love to answer any questions any of you might have about the book.
Thank you so much, Vicki. Thank you for that, and we appreciate your support as always, and the support of everybody in our community, which has been great during the pandemic, and you know, and over the last 38 years, but especially now. And I just want to echo what you said about supporting all small businesses and locally owned businesses, and really now is the time where I think it's most important to focus on the people closest to us, and I know that, you know, for a lot of people resources are tight, which makes it even more important to, you know, to be mindful about, you know, how we allocate those resources. So thank you so much. And I will just before we get into questions, I will say one thing about books. If you go to our website to order and the Crows Took Their Eyes, and we hope that you do, you may see that the book is back ordered. It is back ordered with our distributor right now, but we have ordered more books from the publisher and they are on their way. Everything right now just takes a little bit longer. That's just sort of how it is between the actual printing and the shipping, and you know, everything is just a little bit different with the pandemic, and you know, folks working with smaller staffs and all that kind of thing. So we thank you very much for your patience when you do order the book, and please feel free to go ahead and order it. We will get those in as quickly as we can. We just know that everything's taking a little bit longer, but we do have more on the way. And Vicki will be sending us some signed book plates. So that it's the next best thing to being, you know, to having a signed book, and she will be sending us some signed book plates shortly as well. So we'll be able to send those out with the books. And thank you for doing that, Vicki, for being gracious.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I wanted to start with a question of my own, which is sort of a process question, because you had mentioned not wanting to write this kind of novel for a long time, or, you know, but it sounds like getting to this novel has been an accomplishment. It feels like an accomplishment for you, getting, you know, writing a historical novel, especially about something that you had kind of avoided, and then realized that sounds like you had to write about, you know, you went from, you know, not wanting to write about a topic to feeling compelled to write about that topic, is how it feels. And so I wonder if you can talk about the difference in the process between writing this book and writing your previous books, the mysteries in particular.
It's a huge difference. Huge difference. Writing a mystery, I mean, you start with the idea that something bad has happened, and your heroine is going to figure out what it was, and you are in charge of all of this. You can make up the stuff. Mine is that I think in the first book, Elizabeth doesn't even have a cell phone. So, and when she does have a cell phone, she's out here where I am, where you may or may not have cell phone communication. So there's a lot of leeway in everything I did. Whereas in writing a historical novel, I have to I have to find out all about the Civil War, which, as I said, I had previously not been that interested in. I had to find out how it worked, how the armies were set up. And then the most daunting thing, of course, was finding about the people that I chose to write about, trying to track down everything I could about them and not misrepresent them. Try to be as fair and as honest, given the facts that I could get. And the records from the time one newspaper article, if it was printed from a newspaper that was in favor of the Confederacy, it would say one thing. A newspaper from the other side would say something else. The massacre was variously reported in greatly overblown terms. I mean, how can you overblow something that awful, but it is, or shrugged off as almost nothing. We see this in our news today and things we see on the internet. So it was very hard to try to read the various sources. I read primary sources, as I say, many of which I knew I could not quite trust. I read books that had been written about the massacre. I talked to people who had family stories about the massacre, and oh boy, you get a lot of differences there. One family remembers one thing, another family remembers another. In the end, the best I could do was to sort of come up with okay, this is what, in general, most people seem to think happened. But it was, I could write a mystery novel in a year or less, whereas this took me a long time, just trying to see, well, first of all, trying to make it into a novel, trying to do more than just give the bare facts of what happened. So that was where my fictional character and fictionalizing of Martha White came in. They helped me turn this into a bit more of a story. But it's totally different from writing a mystery.
And how long did you take to do the research before you got started? And perhaps you kept researching after you got started?
It took about a year for me to read sort of all the various things that I could find to read about the Shelton Laurel Massacre and about the Civil War. And about a year before I felt like, okay, I'm kind of grounded. I think I know what this is about, and I think I can start trying to let these people talk. You know, I can pick out my people and try to let them start to talk. Of course, as I went on, and I would come up against something, and I would, oh my goodness, you know, what might so-and-so have been wearing? And that, you know, that can lead you down a rabbit hole on the internet of, you know, 3 hours of research for one sentence. But I really want to be as accurate and not throw in anything that's anachronistic. So there was the basic research, and then as I wrote, there was always research to do. But thank goodness for the internet. That is just a wonderful, wonderful thing. I use the microfiche in the library. I use books, but the internet for all those little small details that I think make a book really interesting. The internet was there for me. It was wonderful.
Excellent. Thank you. So we actually have a basic question from Chance, who I know is an author in the area as well. And Chance is asking, where is Shelton Laurel? Because he'd like to go see. And congratulations on the book.
Where is Shelton Laurel? Well, if you're in Asheville, Madison County is northwest of Asheville, and Shelton Laurel is sort of at the far end, right up next to East Tennessee. It's closer from Shelton Laurel to go to Greenville, Tennessee, than it is to really to go to Marshall. So it's at one end of the county, and it is still kind of remote. It still seems remote.
Yeah. So I wanted to just ask a question about, because you mentioned not just doing research about the Shelton Laurel Massacre itself, of course, but about the Civil War. And something that you said when you first spoke struck me about being drawn to the topic in 2012 when you saw more division in the country. And I would submit, and I'm submitting this on my own behalf, that part of that division that we're feeling now actually, of course, goes back to the Civil War, and more specifically, the way we didn't reconcile with the Civil War truthfully, right? The fact that we do have people who, depending on where you live, could go their entire lives and not give it a thought. Other folks who think about it in a way that embraces this sort of lost cause mythology, engenders all of these thoughts of that are just not true about sort of how the war started and what it really meant. And then so many more that just don't know much about it, right, at all, and don't really think about it. And yet it was this the Civil War and to as large a degree, I think, Reconstruction and how that started and stopped, that really continues to impact our country because we never really dealt with it in an honest way. And so I just wanted to, since you sort of came to it and researched it, I just wondered, what you might have pulled from that process in those terms.
I think I've been undergoing that process during my life. I grew up going to a segregated high school. We stood when they played Dixie. They played the Star Spangled Banner, and then they played Dixie. And we stood, and I swear, I felt a swelling crowd being a rebel. It had nothing to do with the war. It was just like, oh yeah, it's us against them. Mm-hmm. And I know there are still people today that feel that way. It's not so much a race thing or a North-South thing. It's just the pride of being a rebel, which is so sad. As you talked about this, I was thinking about Heather Cox Richardson's book recently, How the South Won the Civil War, which is an excellent book that shows the heritage, how, yes, the North won, but in a lot of ways, the South retained control that we still feel today. That is an excellent book, and I'll bet Malaprop has it somewhere. Wonderful book. It's odd. I mean, I have my grandparents' school textbooks, which are just dreadful in the things that they talk about and they teach. I taught 8th grade at Camp Lejeune when I was first married, and the 8th grade North Carolina history book had a chapter that began, "Have you ever dressed up like a ghost?" and went on to tell how nice the KKK was. This is the North Carolina State history book, and just sort of explained it in a way. And I was appalled at the time, and I talked to the kids in the class about, maybe it wasn't 8th grade, I think it was 6th grade. I talked to the kids in the class about that and said, this is just wrong. But it's still there. It's still everywhere. And the more people point it out, the more other people get their back up. And it's sad. It's really sad. I really hope that this book somehow addresses some of that. It's an uphill battle. But I feel like, I think we're almost, like the peddler said, we're at a tipping point or a ripping place. I don't know. I hope it's a tipping point. I hope so.
I hope so too. We're definitely at a point. We can we can say that.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you for sharing that, because I think it really, it is timely. And always, right? It's always timely, but I think now we're at this place where more and more people are coming to these realizations about really needing to come to terms. And I always go back to the term truth and reconciliation, which was the name of proceedings in post-apartheid South Africa. And I feel like truth and reconciliation are really what are really what's needed for us in this country, and it's never happened. So I think the more we can work on that, the better off we'll all be. So
absolutely.
Yes. Okay, so bear with me while I read for a second, because we were talking and I'm trying to see if this is a question. Nope, that's a comment. You've just gotten a lot of positive comments as well about the book. People looking forward to reading it, and look forward to your writing. But we do have a comment here from someone and perhaps from Jeffrey Shelton. Jeffrey, I hope you don't mind me saying your name out loud. And who was a descendant of one of the victims. And is really looking forward to reading the book. He lives in South Carolina at this point and has visited Madison many times. And so, and that actually brings me to another question, and I'll invite folks to ask your questions as well in the chat if you have them. We do have a few more minutes to go where we can address those if you do have more questions. What has been, you talked greatly about, wanting to deal very carefully with the fact that these were real people that you're writing about, even in a fictional way. What has been the reaction from folks there in Madison County and near Shelton Laurel?
The folks that I talked to in Shelton Laurel have been very supportive of what I've written. A few of them I have shared little tidbits like this is what I think Judy sounds like. I've sent them little tidbits and they've said, yeah, that's good. So, I'll be interested to see when some of them have read the whole book, because none of them have at this point. But everyone I've talked to has been, just incredibly supportive. Even the fellow who told me that Colonel Allen was everything that the Confederates did was justified. Although I will admit, when I spoke to him, I didn't call it the massacre. I called it the event, just because I knew that I knew what side he was on, and that he was like, well, that's good you're writing about it. So we'll see. I just hope no one comes. Well, our barn burned down last year, so no one can come burn it down.
Oh,
anyway.
Goodness.
It was an accident.
Okay.
It was an accident.
Well, I'm sorry about that.
Sort of thing you could worry about.
Right. Well, I guess that is the upside of your barn already being burned down. Right. One less barn to burn. So yeah, hopefully no one would react that strongly. We do have a couple more questions. And so our own Patricia is asking a great one, which is, how did you develop the voice of your villain? Speaking of which.
How did I develop the voice of my villain?
Mm-hmm.
That was nice. Colonel Keith speaks in a very educated way. He's a doctor, a physician, so I assume he has had some education. But a friend of mine, Susan Moore, sent me some copies of letters from her great-great-grandfather, who was a man of that period. Also, somewhat, and people of that time were far more educated than you would think without having gone to college. And they spoke in a very erudite manner. And so I read through these letters of Susan's great-great-grandfather or uncle, whichever he was, and basically just kind of adopted that particular tone as I had Colonel Keith speak. Polly, the wife of Colonel Allen, she too has had some education and is sort of romantic. She later on in the book talks to her friend Emmy that she's writing about reading Sir Walter Scott and dreaming of the nights that would come and take them away. As I wrote these people, a lot of them just started talking to me and said, "This is what I sound like," and it's possible I'm totally wrong, but by the time I finished writing the book, I was convinced this is what these people sounded like.
Well, and that's the advantage of fiction, and of course you have a lot of experience, sort of channeling voices of people in the region. So it's safe to say they were educated guesses.
Right.
And so we have another question from Ruth, which was, what was your most surprising bit of research or a detail that shifted your thinking?
I think the most surprising thing was when I heard from Colonel Keith's great-great-great-granddaughter, who said that he ended his life in Arkansas as a pillar of the community, the Baptist church, well respected and loved. And so the guy that I had been writing pretty much as the villain, I had to end up that way. And that worked out perfectly because people in war often do things that they wouldn't do in other situations. He got through the war and became basically a different person. In the war, people are not what they should be all the time. In fact, I think that was my most surprising thing. I mean, I'm writing away, and all of a sudden I get this thing of, okay, this is who this guy really turned out to be, and I have to readjust my thinking. But it provided a very interesting irony, his fate and the fate of Colonel Allen, who, as I wrote, I liked much better. And then finding out what happened to Colonel Allen, which was another surprise that came to me later in my research. So it's always an ongoing thing, you know. It's the research, a new little bit pops up. Oh my goodness, I have to change that. But it's fun too.
And I think that's such an important point to keep in mind. Again, today, which is that we have a tendency to look at historical figures in these very black and white, all or nothing terms, and to keep in mind that it is actually possible for someone to do something laudable, to be a wonderful parent or spouse, and to still be and do something terrible in another aspect of their life. Right. You know, to be Thomas Jefferson writing about liberty for everyone and still be a slave owner, and to, you know, again, the importance of looking at what that means and what it is, and being able to sort of recognize the good that we can pull out of anyone's actions while not ignoring the bad, and living in a way that's different instead of sort of, you know, pretending that everything was okay, right? Yeah. And so so this is another, you can look anywhere probably in history and find those characters that may do villainous things while, you know, doing other things that are positive in their own communities, for instance.
Well, it's sometimes you think, okay, this is the way the story ought to go. You know, ideally, I would like it to be like this, you know, like this, but life is not like that. And I had to stay true to what happened. And some of that with my fictional character, I didn't have to stay true because I was making that part up. But sometimes things happen that, you know, don't seem like, it's not always the happy ending that you want. Where there are some happy endings in here, there are some that aren't. It's just, you know, that's life.
Yeah. Well, and as a writer, you're making the choice to make it feel real, even though you're making it up. And so, sometimes that means that there's not a happy ending, right? That there's going to be conflict. And,
that's right.
And those are the better, you know, those are the more enjoyable books to read, even if they don't put a smile on our face at every page. You know, they feel, they resonate more. Yeah, when you're true to that reality.
As I said, I lived with these characters so long; they just seemed totally real to me. Did I see any conflicting info to the exact date of the event? I did, but I ended up using the date that most people seem to think it occurred. As I said, you totally can't trust most of the primary sources. People write things down, and they may or may not be right. I did definitely see conflicting information about several of these things, and I basically went with what seemed to be generally accepted. I couldn't spend the rest of my life ferreting out the absolute truth because no one has yet.
Right. And so that date that Jeffrey's stating, the January 18th, 1863, was that the one that seemed to be the one that people agreed
That
on?
seemed to be the general consensus of the various things that I read.
Mm-hmm. So we are at 6:59. The hour has flown, and thank you. I know, and thank you to everyone again for coming. And we did have some technical difficulties, which is why Vicki's on the phone. And appreciate everyone just bearing with us, and Vicki being a trooper, and and we just push along in these virtual spaces. Thank you. And so if you have any last words for us, Vicki, we welcome them. And I just want to say thank you again to everyone for coming, and congratulations to you on the publication of your new book, And the Crows Took Their Eyes.
Thank you, Stephanie, so much. And thank you, Patricia, for all the little notes you're putting out. I really appreciate all of you guys who showed up for this. As I said, so many names I recognize and some that I don't, but thank you all for coming, and support your local bookstore.
Always a great note to end on, Vicki. Thank you. Thanks, everybody. We hope to see you again soon at another event. Please have a wonderful evening and stay safe and stay well, and vote. Early voting has started in North Carolina. I'll just throw in that pitch also.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Have a good night, everyone.